Clara Ames kept her mother's cheese dairy alive on the grass bench above the town, and the respectable side of the little valley had decided her milk cows had carried a killing sickness up into the country, and that her cheese itself was poisoning good people, when the truth was that she was only keeping the one honest trade her mother had left her, and had never yet made a wheel that hurt a living. Soul. She did not know yet that before a bloody Murrain finished cutting a rich man's herd down to nothing, and gave that same man the excuse to condemn her sound little herd off the good grass he had long wanted, a near-silent man who built the valley's windmills and had scarcely said 100 words to her, would set his own name against the whole valley to save her. It had begun, the way the hard turns of a life so often do, with a thing she did not choose. Her mother, Hannah Ames, had built the dairy board by board and cut the cool stone cave into the hillside with her own hands, and had raised Clara in the smell of warm milk and rennet and cave-damp stone, teaching her to set a curd and salt and press a wheel and read it by nose and thumb until she could age a cheese that kept sweet against a hard winter better than any freighted in from the railhead. Then a lung fever took her in 2 short weeks, and because she could work the milk and the curd as well as any dairyman in the territory, Clara went on keeping the dairy, the one trade her hands knew, in a valley that had lately found it had no place for her. And the respectable side of the town, the side with the painted storefronts and the new church, and the cattleman's wife at the head of it, looked at a young unmarried woman keeping a dairy alone and tending her own herd at all hours, and decided well before her mourning was decently done exactly what that made her. The word went round the way such words always do, low and certain and impossible to answer, and it had help, for a man who wanted what she stood on had seen to it that the word had teeth. Here is the thing the town had not troubled to learn. Clara was 26, raised at her mother's elbow by a woman who had no sons and taught her everything she knew because the work wanted doing, and she had never had the least gift for being ornamental. She kept one thing of her mother's above all the good presses and vats, a small worn applewood stamp carved with a wheat sheaf, the first tool her mother had ever cut for the dairy, the mark she had pressed into the rind of every good wheel for 30 years so that folk would know an Ames cheese by its mark. She kept it on the shelf above the press and pressed it into every wheel she made. And the smooth worn wood of it in her hand was the one thing in that whole cold, lonely year that still felt like Hannah and like home. And none of it would matter, because a sickness in another man's cattle and that man's hunger for her grass meant to finish what the gossip had started. The dairy lived or died by her small, clean herd and her cave. The milk came off a dozen sound cows that had never left her bench, and the cheese aged true only in the cool stone cave her mother had cut. But the biggest cattleman in the country had lately driven a great southern herd up the long fever trail onto the range below her, and when a bloody Murrain began to kill that herd by the score, Clara knew, the way anyone who kept stock knew, that a rich man losing cattle he had borrowed against would need someone to blame, and that the good watered bench she stood on was exactly the thing such a man decided he had better own. I have been keeping this hearth a long while now, telling the slow stories, the ones where nobody is rescued by luck, but only by the stubborn daily choosing to do the next right thing with whatever hard season you have been handed. And if that is the kind of story that keeps you good company of an evening, then pull your chair up close and stay with me. Because Clara is about to learn the thing this whole channel keeps circling back to, that the people of town is quickest to whisper about are so often the very ones with the least to be ashamed of, and that it sometimes takes one silent, unlikely soul to see a person plain when the whole valley has made up its mind not to. The cattleman was a broad, prosperous man named Garrett Croft, who ran the most cattle in the country and had a reasonable, regretful way of speaking, and did not come to Clara with threats, but with an offer. He rode up to the bench himself, hat in hand, and told her in his slow, easy voice that it grieved him, that Hannah had been a fine woman, but the fever was loose in the valley now, and folk were frightened, and a small dairy herd running so near his range was a danger the association could not overlook. He would buy the bench offer at a fair price and take the worry off her hands. And perhaps it was for the best, an open grass bench being no fit place for a young woman to keep late hours alone. He let that last part sit gently in the air, the way such men do, and wished her good day, and Clara stood among her mother's scrubbed presses with the cold going all the way through her, for she had nowhere to go and no wish on earth to sell the ground her mother was buried above. The teeth in the town's talk had a name, and the name was Errol Judd. 2 years back, before her mother took sick, Errol had come through as a traveling cattle buyer, purchasing beef and butter along the line, and had courted Clara honestly enough for one summer and spoken of a settled life, then moved on down the road without a word. But he had come back that spring, hired now as Garrett Croft's stock agent and range boss, and finding Clara alone and easy to step on, he had smoothed his own history and served his new master both at once, by letting it be understood, in the worried way of a man protecting the public good, that it was the Ames milk cows that had carried the Murrain up into the valley, and that a decent soul would not put a wheel of her poisoned dairy on his table. It was a lie built to cost him nothing and her everything, and it spread through the valley like a grass fire, for a town that would not eat a fallen woman's poisoned cheese would hardly grieve to see her diseased herd put down. The silent soul who would see her plain through all of it was a widowed Windmill-Wright named Ezra Wolfel, the closest-mouthed man ever to set up on that range. He built and mended the water windmills and dug and cased the wells up and down the country, slow, careful work that suited a man who could stand a whole day alone over a bore-hole and not mind it. He had come west meaning to prove up a homestead of his own, and had worked a good quarter Section 5 long years to patent it. He had lost his wife to a fever their first hard season out, and had not married again, and had got so far out of the habit of company that people took his silence for sourness. But Ezra Wolfel had eyes, and what they had been telling him across 2 years of hauling his rig past her gate was that the young woman the valley had decided to scorn was the finest hand with milk and curd and cave the territory had, who had carried the dairy alone through her mourning and the whispering without once letting the town see her flinch. And he understood 2 things the whole valley would not say aloud: that Garrett Croft did not care a straw where the fever had come from, but wanted her bench and a name to hang his losses on, and would take both the moment her herd was condemned, and that Errol Judd's contagion talk was a plain-built lie the town had swallowed because it was easier than being fair to a lone woman. If you've made it this far into Clara Ames's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. He came to her at the end of a long day, when the light had gone off the grass and she was carrying the evening's milk down to the cave, the spring talking soft over its stones below the bench. He took off his hat and turned it in his big, careful hands, and said the longest thing he had said to anyone in years. He knew it was not his place, but he had seen how Croft's herd was dying and heard what Judd was saying, and it was not right. A thing she had not done costing her the dairy and the good name she had kept clean. And there was one way to slow them, if she could stand it. A married householder had standing before the stock inspector and the association that a lone woman keeping a dairy did not. And a man's name beside hers was far harder for a cattleman to buy off or shout down, and, the moment she was a respectable married woman, Judd's whole ugly whisper had nothing left to stand on. If she would let him marry her, plain and quiet, he could buy her the time the valley meant to deny her, and the talk would lose its teeth. He would sleep in his own camp up at his rig, and ask nothing she did not freely give. She would keep her dairy, her cave, and her own self entire. He made the whole speech to the brim of his hat, for he could not have made it any other way. Clara did not answer that night. She lay awake over the cold dairy and turned it over, for a marriage on paper to a near stranger was a hard, strange bargain. But she understood what he had truly offered, which was not himself but her own good name and livelihood handed back to her, the very things the cattleman and the liar had set out to take, and he had offered it without once making her feel small, as a plain matter of what was right and not of charity. In the morning she went out and set the day's curd and turned the wheels on the cave shelves and found the dairy still hers, and when Ezra came by she told him, steady, that she would take his name and be grateful, and the corner of his mouth moved, which on him was very nearly a smile. They were married 4 days later by the town circuit preacher in the little parlor of Ruth and Amos Purdy, who kept the feed store on the road below and stood as witnesses. There was no ring and no kiss, because that was not what this was. Ezra said the words low, looking at his own hands, and Clara said hers, looking at the window where the last of the light came down over the bench. That evening Clara slept over her own cold dairy, a married woman, and Ezra slept in the camp by his rig, a married man. The little applewood stamp dry on its shelf, and neither of them yet knew what they had begun. The hard turn of that summer was the slow making of them. There was nowhere much to be but at the work, his rig and her cave, and though Ezra kept faithfully to his own camp, a paper marriage has a way of leaking into the daylight, whether two people will it or not. He built her new cave shelves when the old ones sagged, deepened and walled the spring so it ran clear and cold through the driest weeks, mended the leaking dairy house roof, and rehung the cave door so it sealed true, all without being asked, and mostly without a word. And she saw all of it, saw that the silent man did for her in the only language he had, and began, without quite deciding to do for him in return. She kept a plate warm on the stove for whatever hour he came down off his rig, mended the coat he wore to the meeting-house, and learned the sound of his hammer the way you learn a clock. And the talk between them, between two people who had married to stop the town's talk, came slow and then easier, the way a cold room warms when the fire is lit. She found he was not silent because he had nothing to say, but because he had spent years with no one worth saying it to, and if she did not press him the words came low, dry, and once in a while very nearly funny. He told her, a little at a time, about the wife he had lost on the trail and the home place he had meant to raise for her and never had. And Clara did not try to fix any of it. Only let him set it down where another soul could see it. And she found herself telling him things she had told no one, and the dairy had stopped being a place she merely endured. They both felt the change and were half afraid of it, for a thing built to buy a little time has no business taking root. It was the fence that opened the way through, and old Amos Purdy who let the last of it slip. The Murrain worsened on the range below, and the association's talk of condemning her herd grew louder by the week, and Clara braced herself to lose the cows her mother had bred up one careful season at a time, and then one gray morning she walked her bench line and found it fenced, tight and new, deep cedar posts set close, and the wire strung true. Running the whole boundary between her good grass and the fever range, plainly the labor of many quiet nights. It walled her sound heard off from every sick beast on the open range so that no honest man could call her cattle exposed. And she knew whose hands. She had half heard him more than once in the small hours, a maul and a post driver working somewhere along the dark line, and had told herself it was only the wind on the rig. She said nothing to Ezra of the fence. But the next morning Careful, she asked Amos Purdy whether Ezra still meant to move on to his own homestead come the fall, the quarter section he had crossed the whole country to prove up, and the old feed store man, not knowing he was telling her anything, said no, that it beat him, that Ezra had signed the patent over to another man that very spring and put the money God knew where, and that a man did not work 5 years to prove up a piece of ground and then hand it off for no reason. Clara stood a long moment in the bright doorway after Amos had gone back into the store, and something began to come clear that she was almost afraid to look at. That afternoon she went quietly to the land office in town and asked to see the entries on the range below her bench. And there it was in the book, the strip of certified clean grazing that lay between her fence and Croft's fever range had been quietly bought up that spring by a private party, a good clean buffer no association could call exposed, and no cattleman could drive a sick herd across, and the private party who had signed away a proved-up homestead patent to pay for it and hold it and ask nothing was Ezra Wilful. She walked back up to the bench with her ears ringing and understood the whole of it at last. The quiet man had not merely lent her his name. He had taken the home place that was the whole reason he had crossed the country and signed it away to buy the clean grazing strip that walled her bench off from Croft's range. So her herd could never be called exposed, and her grass could never be seized, and had run a tight new fence around her whole bench through the dark besides, and had done all of it silently, so she would never see it or feel she owed him. Clara, who had been taught too young to ask a thing of anybody, felt something she had shut away since the cold weeks her mother died come loose in her chest. That evening, when Ezra came down off his rig, she cut the first wheel of a fresh batch, marked with her mother's sheaf, and put a warm slice of it into his hand, and let her fingers rest against his a moment longer than she ever had, and did not draw them back, and he looked down at her hand, and then up at her face, and did not say one word, and everything was said. But the contagion talk was still abroad, and Clara found she was not content to let it stand. Ezra had bought her the grass and the fence, while letting the town go on believing Errol Judd's lie, and that she would not have. The dairy could be saved with a clean boundary, but her name could not, and her name she meant to win back herself, with the one trade that was truly hers. So she sent to the territorial capital for the stock inspector to come and look her herd over honestly. And she went back through her mother's careful records and her own until she had what she needed, and sent word up and down the valley that when the inspector came, she would answer the charge against her dairy in the open, before anyone who cared to come. For here was the thing Errol Judd had forgotten. Her mother had been a careful, honest dairywoman, and every cow she ever bred and every wheel she ever sold she had put down in a book, plain and dated, and Clara had kept it up after her. Between her mother's dairy book and calving register, her own dated ledger of sales, and a certain trail bill of sale she had gone quietly to fetch. She had the whole truth of it in black and white, and the truth did not favor the man who had lied. The morning came, and half the valley gathered on the flat below the bench to see the poison woman answer for herself, with Errol Judd come along in his good coat and Garrett Croft on his fine horse at the back to watch the finish, and they found they had walked into the wrong morning. Clara stood by her cave with her clean wheels ranged on a scrubbed plank before her, and she did not make a speech. She stood aside while the territorial stock inspector walked her fenced herd, cow by cow, and pronounced every head sound, not one beast touched by the fever. Then she opened her mother's dairy book and her calving register on the plank, and let the men who could read come and read the dates for themselves. The proof that her cows had been bred up on that bench and never once been off it, and that not one soul the talk had named had ever bought a wheel of hers. And then, plain and quiet, she laid down the trail bill of sale beside it, dated and signed, that showed whose great southern herd had come up the fever trail carrying the Murrain into the valley, and out of whose outfit it had spread. There was no cruel word in it. She only stood beside her own honest work and let the valley read the dates and the names, and watch the color drain out of Errol Judd's face, and understand at last which of them had been telling the truth all along. And before the murmuring had died, Ezra Wilful stepped up beside her and said, low but plain, that the grazing strip below the bench was hers and clean, that it had been bought and held clear months since, and no man's sick herd could lawfully cross it or touch her grass. And the land agent was sent for and confirmed every word. Garrett Croft sat his fine horse a moment, with his face gone stiff, having reached for a good grass bench that was never his to take, and a scapegoat that would not hold, and then turned it and rode back down to his dying herd, and Errol Judd was gone off the flat before the crowd had done talking, and gone from the county, they said. Not long after. There was no shouting and no triumph in it. The people simply saw in plain daylight what they had been too quick and too unfair to see before, and a good many of the respectable wives found they had somewhere else to look. The association lifted its talk of a condemnation order that same week. The quarantine line was redrawn where it belonged, and Clara kept her mother's dairy. Free and clear, on the ground she loved. Ezra Wilful had stood at her shoulder through the whole of it with his hat in his hands, and when it was over he did the thing he had never done, and turned to face her plainly where any who cared to could see. He did not make a speech. That was not his way. He only said, low, but not so low that Ruth Purdy a step away could not hear and later gladly tell it, that he had told her in the spring he would go his own road once she was safe, and that he had found he was a liar, because he had no wish on this earth to go any road that did not have her on it, and that if she would have him for true, and not for any name got up against a cattleman and a lie, he would count it the great good fortune of his life. And Clara looked at the silent man who had spent his one dream on her, and fenced her safe through the dark, and never let her see it, and did not make him ask her twice. They were married again in the early fall, for true this time, in the little church that had lowered its voice about her only a season before. With the Purdys and half the valley crowded into the pews, and a few of the respectable wives near the front, looking a shade ashamed, as well they might. The circuit preacher said the words right at last, the clean fall light coming down through the glass. And that evening, after the last of the guests had gone, Clara set her mother's little applewood stamp on the mantel of the bench-top house Ezra had begun to raise for them, where the low gold light came across it, the stamp her mother had begun a life's honest work with, that had marked good sweet cheese through a whole cold, lonely year, and had earned its place at that wedding as much as anyone. In the room. She had come into that hard year, a dairywoman's heir, with a herd they meant to condemn, and a name a stranger had poisoned. Certain the best of her life lay buried in the cold ground above the spring. She grew old on that bench instead, beside the quiet man who put his name beside hers when no one else would. And the good sweet wheels of that whole valley came out of her cave for 40 years, marked every one with the sheaf, and the wives who had once lowered their voices about her brought their whole families to her door. The old applewood stamp sat on the mantel still by then, worn dearer than ever, beside a tall new water windmill Ezra had raised over the spring with his own hands. The old stamp and the good new work catching the low gold light together. A name, it turns out, is the smallest part of what a person is worth, and the cruelest thing a town can do is decide who you are before it has trouble to know you. So here is what I will leave you with tonight, friend. Before the lamp burns low, when the world has believed a lie about you and reached for the one thing you have kept alive with your own two hands, Do you let their whispering and your own pride drive you off your ground? Or do you trust the right soul to see the whole of you in the hard season and stand beside you in the easy one? Tell me which one you would have chosen, and pull your chair up to the hearth again soon.